All right. I think I actually did that, Susan. Look at that, see? Okay, can you see a frog again?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to do a little show and tell today with the Zoom lecture, and so we'll have slides to you to look at. You can hear me, but I'm also going to be holding stuff up to the camera and kind of showing you things. So one of the things you can do is put your viewer up top there in the upper right. You can put your view on speaker view, and then you can actually pull it out a little bit so that you can try to get your screen as best as you can where you can see me and see the slides, and that way you'll be able to look at some of the stuff I'm showing you. Okay. So who better to start with than our American naturalist, John Muir, right? He said, if you look closely enough at any one thing, you'll find it connected to everything else. And so when we start looking at climate change and animals, undoubtedly, we cannot help it but have a conversation about plants and humans and microbes and fungus and other things. This is the beauty of nature, but it's also the risk, because when you mess with one thing, you mess with everything else. Yes? And so there is both a wisdom and a warning in John Muir's lesson here. Now, when we look at wildlife populations around the world right now and extinction rates, right, this is a big thing that zoologists look at. We look at the extinction rates. We know that right now, Elizabeth Colbert wrote a phenomenal book called The Sixth Extinction, okay? There's been 5 major extinction events on animals and life over all of Earth's history. And the first 5 were because of geology, right? Volcanoes, earthquakes, asteroids, things like that. But Elizabeth Colbert argues, and I think accurately so, that right now we are in the 6th extinction of animal life. Except this one's not caused by volcanoes and earthquakes and asteroids. This one's being caused by humans. It's anthropogenic, is a term that we use to say human caused. And so if we take a look at what's causing the loss of these animals, the good news, I guess, in some ways is it's not climate change. Climate change is not the #1 leading cause of our loss of animal life. The #1 leading cause of our loss of animal life right now is habitat loss and exploitation. It is us. Animals are losing too much habitat to survive, and those that are around, we are killing, hunting, eating, using, and doing something with, right? So habitat loss, habitat pollution, exploitation, those actually are ahead of climate change right now. But the problem is we're seeing climate change creep up and up as far as how significant it is to our loss in animal life. If we take a look at the assessments being done right now, you know, who's at risk out there? Well, you can see this is just a couple groups, but you can kind of see in the yellow to the yellow reddish color that birds, amphibians, corals, even reptiles are having varying amount of climate susceptibility. Oh, I just lost, I have to move around in the lab, I guess. 1 second. See if I can move around, have the sensors come back on. There we go. All right. I've been here for a while. If you stop moving, apparently the lights go off. All right, here we go. Hopefully that won't happen on our animals, right? We don't want the lights to go out on them. So when we talk about climate change here, one of the #1 things you hear about, of course, is carbon dioxide levels and global warming, right? This is not subjective. This is not opinion. It's very clear. We can see what's happening with global concentrations in carbon dioxide, and we know what's happening with our global temperature as well. The bottom line is we are getting significantly warmer out there. And I don't want you to let scale be a factor here, because when you think about people saying, well, we're 1 degree, 1.5 degrees warmer Celsius, you might be inclined to blow that off as what's 1 degree difference. And I want to remind you that the difference between ice and water is 1 degree. That's all it takes, right? And so 1 degree in science can be a very, very big deal. And sure enough, this global warming, specifically, not just climate change overall, but global warming is causing a big problem for animals. Let me give you a couple examples. We'll start off in the oceans with our coral reefs, right? 72% of our planet is water, and coral reefs line all these different areas of our oceans and coastal shallows. And I want you to understand 50% of all ocean life, listen to that number, 50% of all ocean life has some association with coral reefs. Either they're there as adults, they frequent them, they feed on them, they raise their young in them. 50% of all ocean species have some association with coral reefs. And our corals are in trouble right now. It turns out that when our corals are sitting on the reef in the shallows and they're actually going in and they're feeding, they're also getting fed off of these really cool algae that grow inside their soft tissues. And those little cool algae are called zoanthelia, right? You can see them here green on the slide. So those zoanthelia live inside the corals and they live symbiotically. So the algae gets a safe place to live and the corals, that little algae photosynthesizes and the corals get fed by it. So this is mutualism. It's a beneficial relationship, yes? Well, it turns out that when you turn the water degree up by just a degree or so, corals do something really strange that we can't totally explain. And that is they spit out their algae. They eject these zoanthelia algae from their tissue. We're not sure why. They're not choosing to do it. It's just a biology thing. So they eject these algae out of their soft tissues, and now they no longer have their algae residents there to help them feed. And as a result, they do something called bleaching. And so they lose their bright color, they lose their helpful beneficial algae, and eventually the little coral polyps will die off, and you'll wind up with coral reefs looking like they're on the right with these white kind of skeletons like you see right here, where all that's dead coral. The structure's there, but the living coral itself is gone, and that reef ultimately dies, affecting 50% of all species of ocean life if we lose corals to bleaching. So when you think about a coral reef, of course, the first thing you think about is the Great Barrier Reef off the northeastern coast of Australia. This is one of the largest coral reefs in the world, stretching over 1,300 miles, people. That's as long from Maine to Florida along the US eastern coast. This is an absolutely massive structure you can see from space. It's been here for millions of years, and it's been made by animals. An animal structure you can see from space, which is just incredible. And right now we know that over 50% of the Great Barrier Reef has been bleached out or is bleaching right now, and it has happened in the last 30 years. This thing has been there for millions of years, and we've been watching it for hundreds of years. And now we've lost almost 50% of it in the last 30 years. That's during our watch to bleaching. This is a huge concern for loss of biodiversity, a loss of an incredible biological natural structure, and we know the long stretching ramifications of losing our coral reefs with all those other species out in the ocean. Huge cause for concern. When we look at climate change impacts here, well, I want you to notice that this is a graph of a figure of Australia. It's not just about coral bleaching. We can talk about coral bleaching, but there's another type of habitat out there that many people don't know a lot about. And it's one of my favorites, and I've circled it here. This is seagrasses. So seagrasses are a unique type of habitat that can be found around the world. Do you realize that there are giant prairies of grass that stretch on for hundreds of miles that are underneath salt water? I mean, that to me is phenomenal, people, because when I put plants in salt water, they die, right? You can't give your fern salt water. If I put grass and I pour salt water on it, it dies in my backyard. But there are literally just miles and miles of grassy prairies that grow and have adapted and evolved to live under the ocean in salt water, and they're called seagrasses. I've worked with these on islands in the Gulf of Mexico where I work mostly with snakes, but I've dove and snorkeled through a lot of seagrass beds, and they're incredible diverse communities of animals there. Just like the coral reefs, these seagrass beds act as areas for feeding for a variety of invertebrates. So you have all types of shrimp and crabs and things out there. Here, a very special invertebrate here. This is called a horseshoe crab. And horseshoe crabs are all over the Gulf of Mexico, and I see them constantly rummaging through those seagrass beds, using the little appendages underneath to eat up algae and vegetation, completely harmless. And these things have been around since before the dinosaurs. And so these horseshoe crabs use those seagrass beds, all types of hermit crabs and other crustaceans. And very importantly, fish use it as a nursery bed for their young and their eggs. It's very protected to be down in that grass. And so when you go through that grass, you will see just thousands of small little fish or clusters of fish eggs in there. And then also sea turtles and manatees use it for food. So you will literally, like we think of cows in a pasture roaming around eating grass, you can dive down there at the right time of year and see manatees swimming around, just gobbling up all this seagrass. And some species are even called turtle grass because our sea turtles come in and they consume these grasses as well. If you have a water temperature increase by just even a half a degree or so, we see all types of algae and bacteria and stress on our seagrass beds. Now we have huge global conservation efforts trying to not just save the rainforest and the coral reefs. I love rainforests and coral reefs and everything in them, but there are other things out there that we have to look at as well that are extremely important, like our coastal wetlands and our seagrass beds. Now, speaking of something near and dear to my heart, let's talk about sea turtles here. So turtles, you might not know this, but even if you're a sea turtle, but all turtles around the world lay eggs. They lay these little ping pong shape and size leathery eggs like you see here, and they have to lay them on land. Even though sea turtles might live in the ocean their entire life, they have to come to shore to lay their eggs on land.
We can't really hear you.
Can everybody hear me now?
I had
It's like
trouble, so I
really
turned my
quiet.
volume up.
Yep, just make sure your volume's up on your computer. Mine's up all the way. And I'll try
Now you're fine.
All right, excellent. Thank you, everybody. So these sea turtles come in and they go up on land and they lay their eggs, yes, in the sand like you see here. Well, there's something very interesting. All turtles do this. We can even go to something more local here. Look at here. Here we have a common snapping turtle, yes. And so all turtles, even our painted turtles and common snapping turtles do this. They come up on land and they dig a nest cavity and they lay their eggs in the sand. Now there's something out there called temperature sex determination. And what that means, you can see from the graph down there, is that when it comes to certain reptiles like turtles, if the temperature is lower than 29 degrees Celsius or so, you mostly get those eggs becoming males. And if the temperature is a little bit over 29 to 30 degrees Celsius, you tend to get more females. And with the way these animals have adapted and evolved, when you have a clutch of about 100 eggs, it roughly turns out to be about 50-50 when the temperature is just right. You get about half males, half females, and it keeps the population stable. Well, in the last several years here, decade or more, we've been looking at these ratios. And as the sand gets warmer, as the air gets warmer, as the water rushing up and feeding that sand gets warmer, when you turn the sand temperature up by a degree or so, you shift your ratio of males to females. You wind up getting more females in the population and not many males. And right now we're finding, like, for example, the green sea turtle down there, the green sea turtle populations, they're seeing ratios of 161 females to 1 male, completely skewing the sex ratio. And so now we're not killing turtles directly, right? They're not washing up dead and we're not hunting them or taking their eggs. But when you have populations to where there's a 160 to 1 female versus male ratio, there simply will not be enough males to go around to actually keep that population stable. This is a big factor of temperature that we don't think about what it's doing to turtle eggs down in the sand. And by the way, they're not the only one that has temperature sex determination. Crocodilians do too. So alligators and crocodiles who also lay their eggs in the substrate, when you turn it up by a degree or so, you wind up getting many more female crocodiles and alligators than you do males. Since we're talking animal physiology, let's just take a look at something interesting here. This is kind of new. We're looking at, when you look at animal physiology, we have something that is known as, and what we call, your critical thermal limit. Okay, what is your CTL? I'm not going to get too technical here, but basically what it means is that for many animals, at some point, it is either too hot or too cold to live. It is too hot or too cold to be able to survive. It is too hot, too cold to be able to move. And it might even be life-threatening if things get too cold or too hot for some animals, yes? And sure enough, climate change has caused some concerns with animals finding it to be too hot to survive. But what we're finding in addition to this physiology being affected is not critical thermal limits, but a new concept in zoology that we're talking about more and more called thermal fertility limit, your TFL. What's the TFL mean? Well, what it means is that we're finding that when you start turning air temperature or water temperature up by a degree or so, and species have evolved and adapted to be in a very narrow range of when it's most ideal to be able to mate, when it's most ideal to be able to make egg or sperm, when it's most ideal to be able to have your embryos or your eggs survive. There's a very small temperature range there. And what we're finding is that we're actually seeing fertility. You can see on the graph there in several species, we're seeing fertility start to go down because of particularly in aquatic species, because of the temperature of our oceans. For example, you can see here's one example looking at shark pups. We actually see that shark pups are developing too quickly when they're still in their pup embryonic stage. They're developing too quickly because it's hotter. And as a result, they're being born malnutritioned. And so we're losing shark pups at a very alarming rate right now because they're simply being born and developing too quickly because that temperature has been turned up. And some of the same thing is happening with fish and little tiny fish babies that are out in our ocean water. And so we're not just looking at the abiotic non-living parts of climate change, like CO2, air temperature, water temperature. We're now digging down as scientists even into fertility and physiology of animals and how this is having an effect. And it's measurable. This is the key to it, that we can actually go out. You can do this, right? First, you got to get a degree in biology and pass our classes. And then you get out there and you learn these techniques and you can get out there and catch sharks and measure fertility. And we can actually quantify and measure this. So we don't have to talk about belief or opinion, right? This isn't politics. This is science. Speaking of fertility and water temperature, we are seeing the inverse in some species. In others, it's causing a drop in population numbers, but we're also seeing in other animals, we're seeing an increase in population number because of turning up water temperature by a single degree. So a couple really interesting examples. One of the biggest ones right now, no pun intended, is around Japan. There is a problem with the giant Japanese jellyfish, like you see down there in the lower left. This is the Nomura jellyfish. This is a jellyfish that is the size of a Honda Civic. It weighs several hundred pounds. It's the size of a bathtub. I think the proper word is ginormous. Yes. And you can see the size of these jellyfish. They are all over Japan right now. And Japan fishing industry is in a horrible situation here because they don't know what to do. These jellyfish are all around their fishing waters. When they go to raise their nets, this is what they pull up. They can't get to their fish. The fish they do get to are covered in jellyfish stings. And in some cases, it's actually capsizing fishing boats because the jellyfish just are too heavy when you catch that many of them. They have no idea what to do with these jellyfish. They don't taste good. They're not much good for fertilizer. There's no other use for these jellyfish for an economic standpoint, and it's shutting down their fishing industry. And so this happens. Why? Nomura jellyfish have been around Japan. Oh, here we go again. One more time. Nomura jellyfish have been around Japan for millions of years. So why the population explosion now? Well, it turns out that if you raise the temperature of the water by 1 degree Celsius, you increase their reproductive output 100-fold. These things unbelievably start to produce large amounts of eggs and sperm, and then you have a population explosion like you see here. The same thing's happening off the coast of Australia with a relative of the Portuguese man-o-war. This is a very, very dangerous type of jellyfish called the Portuguese man-o-war. Well, there's one called the blue bottle jellyfish that you see there on a beach in Australia and around New Zealand. You can see that the beaches right now are being littered with blue bottle jellyfish because their population numbers are exploding because the same thing. We turn the water temperature up by 1 degree, and ultimately this increases their reproductive output. And it's also not just in Australia and Japan. You can go to California and they're having a huge problem with the number of giant squid that are out there now. You used to go out and every so often catch 1 or 2 giant squid a year. And now fishing boats and charter boats are having charter outings to go out, not and catch, fish and other things, but to go out and catch giant squid, because they're catching literally hundreds of squid a night now that they've never ever seen before, all because of water temp being turned up. Imagine the connections. Go back to that food web in John Muir. Think about the connections this has in the natural system when you have this type of imbalance in population growth while other species are dying off, right? When we think about the fishery industry, this is not just caused because of climate change, right? We have huge exploitation of fish in the sea with our fishing industries on a global scale. Okay, we are pulling off more and more fish here. You can see the number of fish in the sea has been declining for several decades now, in all parts of the world. Feeding the world with fish and the way we're doing it is a huge problem with climate change. And now this is not climate change directly killing off the fish. This is us going out there and catching fish in an unsustainable way. 50% of all plastics that we find in our ocean come from industrial fishing. All right. But what's interesting here, and what is a problem, is that if you take a look at the data, while the number of fish are going down, this is the actual catch of fish per year, as well as the CO2 and the type of energy used to run all those ships and to keep this industry running. And so what it shows is that while fish populations are going down, we're actually having to fish more and more and more. We're having to have more and more ships out there. That's more and more CO2, more fossil fuels, more plastic, which drives the temperature up, which affects our fish populations going down while we're catching them at rates that are not sustainable. So this is a huge problem that we're going to have to figure out. If we're going to use fish to feed the world somehow, we have to figure out how to do this in a much more sustainable way. And fish are responding to climate change, not just catch, not just the fisheries industry. If you go back and take a look in the 1970s, where we saw everything from cold water species to subtropical to tropical species, if you looked at what we caught many more cold water species and temperate species back in the 70s. Now we see a shift, and that we're catching less of the cold water species. They are migrating to different areas, and we're catching more of the subtropical and tropical fish species because they actually can handle the warmer water because they've adapted in, tropical and subtropical waters. But we're seeing a loss, which is a lot of what we eat. We're seeing a loss in a lot of these cold water species. And so people like you, right, they get degrees, they go out on a boat and they put trackers and they go out in nets and they catch. And sure enough, we have followed this. It's kind of a confusing graph, but you can see from 1968 to 2015, we take different species of fish. This is halibut. And you can see, sure enough, you can see the migratory routes. They are shifting further north. These species like crab and pollock and cod, they are shifting further north. Off the coast of Alaska, they are shifting over the last 50 years further and further and further north. Why are fish populations moving further north, right? They are moving north because that is where the colder water is. And so as we turn water temperature up, we are changing the migratory behavior of our fish. We're changing the fishing industries for humans as well. It's not just fish that are being affected by climate change and migratory patterns. We see something, for example, here in bird migration. When I think of animal migration, especially from Michigan, I think about birds, yes. And so we're seeing something like the red-eyed vireo, very common bird that we see here in Michigan, very beautiful bird to go out and look for. You can see that beautiful striping and red eye that they have. And if we take a look at the migratory ranges of the red-eyed vireo, you can see here on this map in red, sure enough, we see red-eyed vireos shifting further and further north. They are shifting north in their migratory ranges because the southern limits of their range are now too hot for them. And so they are shifting further north. There's limited resources, so they have to keep going further and further out to find those. And we're seeing a change in their migratory behavior. One of my favorite migratory stories in animals, of course, is the monarch butterfly. you have this incredible migration that happens, right? Where you have butterflies from all over Canada and North America. In the fall, they start to migrate south by the millions. And ultimately, they all go down and migrate down to this one little tiny area in Mexico, where they overwinter there, lacing the trees by the millions. It looks like a forest of monarch butterflies. You can see the image down there, just absolutely incredible. And it coincides with the Day of the Dead celebration in Mexico. This is why the monarch butterfly is representative in the Day of the Dead festivities and festivals, because they thought the monarchs represented the spirits and souls of the dead and their loved ones returning to them, which is quite beautiful. The problem with this is that now, since it's warmer, monarch butterflies are not staying down there as long as they should. They are waking up sooner from their winter dormancy, and they're starting their migration back too soon. And as a result, the resources for them might not be there in those migratory routes yet, all the flowers and the blossoms and the nectar and pollen they feed on. And as a result, we're seeing a decrease in the number of monarchs that are returning and a decrease in the number of monarchs that are going back down to Mexico for the last several decades. And that's all before we start talking about what we're doing with our agricultural fields and pesticides and insecticides to grow our crops. Butterflies, like you see here, all butterflies, not just the monarchs, butterflies have amazing little chemosensory structures on their feet. So when you see a butterfly and it lands on a flower, you'll see it do a little dance, kind of stepping before it starts feeding. And what it's doing is it's tasting with its feet. They have little chemoreceptors where they're tasting chemicals on that flower to know whether or not it's a potential food source. Well, if that flower or those plants that they're resting on when they land are laced with pesticides and insecticides, sure enough, they're going to die. And so we have a new term. You've heard of an endangered species, right? You've heard of a threatened species, endangered. We now have a new term in zoology, and that is an endangered biological phenomenon. And the monarch migration is an example of that. It is a biological phenomenon that occurs nowhere else in the world. It's very, very unique. And that biological phenomenon of the monarch migration is now considered endangered or threatened. We could lose it. Okay, what's going on with polar bears, right? Polar bears have basically become the textbook example, the mascot for climate change, right? For species extinction, it was the panda with the World Wildlife Foundation. What's going on with polar bears? Well, it's very simple. We know that we're losing about 13% of our glacial polar ice caps every decade or so. You can see here the range in red going from 1979 to what we have now. We lose about 13% of our glaciers every decade. You let that go on for 30, 40, or another 10, 30 years, we're not going to have any. Polar bears are now being found to either be malnourished and emaciated, like the one you see down at the bottom there, or we're finding them dead, drowned. Now you have to understand something. A polar bear evolved to live in these Arctic conditions tens of thousands of years ago. Their whole body has evolved to be able to swim in Arctic cold water. They have insulating fur. They have hollow hairs to give them good insulation. They have webbed feet. They've got oils that help their fur dry. They've got fat reserves on their body. I mean, it's almost impossible to drown a polar bear. That's like saying you're going to drown a dolphin. How is that even possible for polar bears to drown? Well, what happens is that polar bears hunt for seals and other animals on the ice, and then they jump in the water and they swim going over to the next glacier that's a mile or two away. But polar bears aren't a good judge of distance any more than you and I are looking at a faraway iceberg to know if that's a mile or 10 miles, or well, there was one over there last month, so I'm just going to go for it. As a result, they're drowning. They're malnourished. It's harder to find food. Their food hangs out on the ice as well. Things like seals and sea lions and so forth that use the ice as well. And when you take away habitat, go back to one of those first images I showed you. When you take away habitat, we lose wildlife. Habitat protection and wildlife conservation go hand in hand. They're not inseparable. But now we're finding climate change is causing a loss in a very unique habitat, our glaciers, our ice caps. And as that happens, when you take away habitat, it only follows that we're going to lose wildlife. And sure enough, we're seeing that. We're seeing it with polar bears. We're seeing it with other species that use these icebergs as well, like seals and even our penguins. And as you can imagine, well, wait a second, if all that ice is melting, doesn't that mean that our water levels might go up in our oceans? Well, you're not wrong. Sure enough, we've got ocean levels going up by several inches. And now if we look at coastal communities around the world, just take a look at right here in the United States. All these colored areas here represent areas of concern for coastal flooding. Miami's been underwater. We even had New York City declare a flood warning in fall of last year, while the New York subways were filling up with water, right? When you have more severe storms, when you have iceberg melt, you're going to have ocean levels come up. And there is another habitat out there that we don't talk enough about. Again, I love rainforests and I love coral reefs, but we don't talk enough about seagrasses and we don't talk enough about coastal wetlands. Folks, land and water do not come together like a nice sandwich where you have water and then boom, here's the land and that's it, right? That's maybe how shorelines work in the Great Lakes here in Michigan. But around the world, you find that there are salt marshes and mangrove forests that can go in like fingers to each other for miles inland. It's not just the water stops and land starts. In some cases, those two habitats interweave in beautifully, incredibly biodiverse wetland habitats like salt marshes and mangroves. I have worked in these. They are absolutely magical to slush your way through a salt marsh and see all the biodiversity there. When you start having water levels, even by a couple inches, start to flood these areas out, they cycle by water level tides. They cycle by high tide and low tide and water being at a certain level, even water being a certain salinity or temperature. When you start increasing coastal waterways and wetland areas by an inch or two of water, it completely can change the dynamic. And so there are really incredible species out there, again, like our crustaceans. We've got everything. Look at here. I got all types. We've got freshwater snails and hermit crabs that are out there using these wetlands. You've got bivalves like your clams and so forth, and your other types of mollusks that are out there in these wetlands, marsh snails. We've even got really cool things in our tidal areas like our sea stars and so forth. All these species that are out there using these. If we increase that level, and change the chemistry of the water there, we could potentially lose all these species as well. Since I mentioned chemistry, yes. What do we know? Well, we know that our world is a water planet. We're 72% water, yes? And we also know that we're spitting out unbelievably large concentrations of CO2 every year. Well, if you know your chemistry, CO2 and water does a great job of absorbing CO2. It's like a sponge, right? And so water will absorb CO2 and turn it into something called carbonic acid. So it's great that the water is taking the CO2 out of the air. That's very helpful. Thank you, oceans around the world. But it's bad in a way because of chemistry, because water and CO2 combine to make an acid. And so as a result, we have a new concern. It's not just about the number of storms and rain and hurricanes. It's not just about global warming. It's not just about air temperature or water temperature. We now have a concern about ocean acidification. And what that means is that we have gone out, we have been measuring very closely the pH of our oceans, and the pH right now, you can see from the 1850s to now is dropping. We should be just slightly above 8. Oh, here we go again. All right, we should be slightly above 8. And what we're finding is that right now, if we take a look where we're at today, right now we're somewhere just around 8 or so, just above 8. Now you might say, well, hey, listen, 8.15 to 8 is not a big deal, right? Wrong. If you know anything about the chemistry of pH, it's a log base 10 scale for you mathematicians out there, it's log base 10. And so what that means is when you go from a pH of 8 to a pH of 7, that's not 1 times more acidic, that's 10 times more acidic. So if you go from a pH solution of 8 down to a pH of 7, that 7 solution is 10 times more acidic. And so when we see small changes in pH, it equals huge changes chemically, yes? Think about the blood in your body, 7.3, 7.4, that's all you get. You go a little bit more than that, you're in trouble. Well, so are our oceans. And so by all that CO2 in the environment, we're sucking it up in our oceans and it's making our ocean pH drop. Now, why is that a problem? The problem is that there are numerous species in our oceans. Look at this, corals, our mollusk shells like you see here, crustaceans that are out there, right? Our bivalves like you see right here. All these species have calcium that they use to make their exoskeleton in their shells. And so maybe you remember from your grade school science classes, you ever take a piece of chalk and throw it in pop or throw it in vinegar and leave it for a couple of days? Well, what happens? It starts to dissolve it, right? And so when you have coral, for example, I'll take one example, take a look at this coral here. This is healthy coral, the way it's supposed to look with all those geometric shapes and patterns in it. If you throw this in a solution of around 8 or 7.8 for a couple of days, you wind up with this dissolved, chunky, chalky looking block. And species can't survive off of this. And so we now see that not only are our corals being hit by losing their algae, by bleaching, but they're also being dissolved because of ocean acidification. But this is not just about corals. We find that there are these microscopic little organisms all over the ocean water. We call them zooplankton, right? If something is planktonic, it floats in the ocean, right? It floats in the open water column. There's phytoplankton, that's little algae type stuff that photosynthesizes, but then there's zooplankton. And zooplankton, many of it has small little amounts of calcium and calcium carbonate and things that are sensitive to acids that help their bodies grow. And you can see here kind of a microscopic view of what that zooplankton looks like. Many of those species are susceptible to having their bodies not develop right or even dissolve and die if they are in too much of an acidic solution. And so we're going through now and recognizing that we are losing our zooplankton. Zooplankton, if we lose that, folks, that is the base of our food web. That is that nutrient supply that keeps everything else in the ocean alive. And we're losing them right now, not just because of temperature, not just because of plastics, not just because of pollution, but we're losing the diversity and the number of our zooplankton animals because of their bodies are not developing properly because the solution that they're growing up in is too acidic. Then we get on to land, right? What do we find on land here? Well, we find that we are getting less and less rainfall. In certain areas, it's getting very hot and we're getting less rainfall. And that's going to affect species in agriculture and humans. We're seeing less rainfall and we're seeing a lot of death in domestic animals that are free ranging and so forth. We're finding these animals dying off. This is not only bad for the animals. I don't think cows are in danger of going extinct, but we obviously understand not only is that a very harsh death for these animals, but we also find that this is going to affect human populations and food security. When you have rainfall, right? When we start to get changes in rainfall and those water levels, I want you to think about something like a watering hole in Africa. I want you to think about how many species of animals, not domestic livestock, but just think about those wild animals that are out there that use those watering holes. Go watch Lion King. Yes, these are incredibly important biodiverse areas that animals depend on. And if you've ever watched an African documentary on Animal Planet, you know that everything congregates around these water holes and they use them right up to the rainy season when it comes back again. And life depends on these. And if we lose these watering holes, if we lose these, then we're going to lose these animals and the biodiversity. We can't go around logistically and fill back up watering holes with hoses. We can't do that. So we have to rely on our weather and climate patterns to be functioning normally to fill these water holes up. The Amazon rainforest. You realize the Amazon forest floods by 40 to 60 feet every year, and that there are unique species of fishes that only reproduce once the Amazon floods and they go into these flooded forests. Absolutely incredibly magical habitat that we could lose if we start to lose our rainfall. You cut down rainforest, people, you get less rain. It's very simple and it's measurable. We even have incredible amphibians out there. This is the African bullfrog. These bullfrogs sit underneath the substrate in Africa for years, waiting for the heavy rains to come. They sit down in a mucousy cocoon, waiting for the rains to come. And when those heavy rains finally do occur every 4 or 5 years or so, these frogs come up out of the ground by the thousands and breed and then go back under. If we lose those rains, we'll lose these species. I don't even know where to begin with this topic. I mean, how can we not talk about rainfall and habitat and plants and insects? Right? The sheer amount of beneficial insects we have around the world is just in the hundreds of thousands, right? And so what we know, I'll give you one example here, look at pollinators. We know that right now, about 70% of the food we eat, 70% of the food we eat has some association with pollinators. Bees, butterflies, beetles, flies, things like that. 70% of our food security has something to do with pollinators. And we also know that our insect populations are being affected by climate change, as well as pollution and chemicals and things like this. This is a big cause for concern. If we lose our insects or our plants, that's like losing phytoplankton in the ocean, right? Our terrestrial ecosystems can't function sustainably without plants and insects, right? And so this, not everybody is passionate about bugs and beetles as they are pandas and polar bears. I get it. But ecologically, this is very important. And as climate change occurs, we're not only losing our beneficial species, but we're also seeing an increase in some of our harmful species. So we're starting to see huge problems with parasites. We're starting to see problems with flies and mosquitoes. There's a huge problem in Alaska right now with the amount of flies and mosquitoes that are coming out every year because the cold season's shorter and the warmer weather is there longer and the temperature's turned up a little bit. We're seeing massive, not massive, but larger die-offs in caribou, that's reindeer, same thing, caribou and moose populations up in those colder climates because those flies and those animals, those hosts, have adapted to be in a certain temperature range. And now we've changed the rules. We've turned it up a degree or so, and the scales have tipped in favor of the biting flies and the parasites. Here in Michigan, we're seeing this as well with, of course, tick infestations in deers, right? This is a huge problem. It's not only flies and mosquitoes and parasitic worms and things like this that are increasing. We also have a very interesting and a very sad phenomenon occurring right now. You can go anywhere online and look up global amphibian decline. Look at our global amphibians. Amphibians, people, are what we call bioindicator species. These are environmentally sensitive species that will let us know if there's a problem in our environment. They tend to die off first, like the canary in the coal mine. And so right now we recognize there is a global decline around the world in amphibian species, so much that right now 43% of the species that we've looked at and examined, we haven't looked at all of them. We got to get people like you out there counting amphibians, and not worrying about mosquitoes and wet boots. 43% of the amphibians that we've looked at right now are threatened or endangered and declining. That's a very, very large number. And so what's going on here? Well, it turns out it's not directly climate change, that's indirect. What's killing off these amphibians around the world right now is a type of fungus. It's called chytrid, C-H-Y. Chytrid fungus is an aquatic type of fungus. When you think about fungus, we probably think of something like this. We think about really cool mushrooms and shelf fungus and puffballs growing on rotted logs in the forest floor. Those are beneficial decomposing fungus, but these are fungus that are parasitic. And so they get into the skin of our amphibians. And when they get into the skin of the amphibian, underneath here, they actually start to eat away at the skin of the amphibian until ultimately it kills them. And so we have found ponds all over the world. You can see there in yellows where it's been detected. We have found ponds where we have found hundreds of dead frogs just floating in the water and washed up to shore. And when we go take a cotton swab and swab their underlegs and look at under the scope, sure enough, we find this little tiny chytrid fungus right here. Now, wait a second here. This is like the Japanese jellyfish. Chytrid fungus has been around for millions of years. So have these amphibians. Amphibians were here before the dinosaurs and after. They outlived them. So how in the world, why is chytrid fungus killing off our amphibians now and not 1,000 years ago? And the answer, as you guessed it, is, yep, temperature. When you turn that temperature up by just a degree or so, it tips the scales in favor of massive chytrid fungal growth in our ponds and lakes and rivers and streams. And as a result, the immune system of our amphibians has only evolved so much and adapted to be able to fight off so much chytrid fungus. But when you tip the scales in that direction, you can start losing species because of climate change favoring fungal growth, like fungal parasites. And it's not just amphibians. Look at here, one near and dear to my heart. I've worked with Massasauga rattlesnakes here in the state. There is a new concern of a fungus called snake fungal disease that is growing on the bodies and the faces of snakes here in Michigan and in North America. It's on our Massasauga rattlesnakes. It's in water snakes, garter snakes. We're finding this around Michigan and around North America right now with this snake fungal disease. Same thing happens here with bats. You might have heard about white nose fungus. And sure enough, white nose fungus is a parasitic fungus that can grow on the wings and the faces of bats. It wakes them up during hibernation because it's eating away at their skin. And as a result, the bats actually freeze to death because there's no food in February if you wake up because your face is covered in this parasitic fungus. When the temperatures are warmer, it shifts the odds in favor of the fungus. And we're now losing millions of bats to white nose fungal disease. Climate change is not helping this. If we start doing a survey of all of our animal species, 2 million or so animals in the world, we start doing a survey of the effects of climate change, we find it everything from our invertebrates, our insects, we find it from jellyfish all the way up to things like moose, and of course, fisheries, humans, and snakes and frogs. Now, it's not all bad news, right? I don't want to be negative. There's a huge concern, and we have to be honest about it, and we have to use science and evidence to show it. But we also know there's things that we can do. There's things that you can do by volunteering, by educating yourselves, by getting involved, by looking at different organizations that are fighting climate change, by taking classes here at Washtenaw to educate yourself in environmental science and biology and so forth, and the physical and life sciences. And very importantly, to all of you out there, one of the most important things you can do that can cause instantaneous change for climate science is, of course, to get out there and vote. Yes? So, hopefully you got a chance to learn a couple new facts about climate change and wildlife and its effects on animals. Maybe you got the chance to see a couple new things you've not seen before. I always appreciate anyone who comes out on a Saturday to listen to me talk about animals and science. That's a good first step, everybody. So thank you so much. And I'll gladly answer any questions while we can in the last 10 minutes here. So, okay. Thank you, everybody.
In your opinion, is it possible to help in the terms of what we're doing without completely changing drastically the way we live our lives? Because I feel like that's probably one of the main reasons why, because we know there's a problem and a lot of people know it exists. It's just that to do what the earth needs to heal would basically entail us to change our lives very dramatically, and that's why we don't change. But like,
yeah, there's Dr. Stephen Stearns out of Yale gave a very convincing argument. Here we go. Last time, I think. And what Dr. Stearns said was that there's a fundamental math equation here. The problem here is the number of individuals on this planet, right? How many billions of people we have on our planet times the number of resources that each one of them is using or needs to survive, and exactly what those resources are. So we have a lot of people and we need a lot of things to survive. And then there's also differences in how we get those resources. And so which one of those variables can we change? I'm not going to Thanos this thing and, half the people are gone. We're not going to do that. But if we can't change the number of people on our planet, and I'm not necessarily sure we should, what we can change is the number of resources and consumerism that we use, and also how we use it. I like clothes. I like driving my car and not having to ride a horse to campus on a day like today. I like being able to go to a grocery store and have a lot of variety of foods and so forth. I like those things. But how we get there, I think, is where we can make a difference. And again, a big thing for me is, and you can do this right now, maybe we can't go out and buy an electric car tomorrow, or, just give up our degrees and our jobs and just go volunteer our time to saving the whales. I get that. But every single day, every single one of us makes at least a dozen decisions on what we eat, what we buy, how we go through our transportation, how we wash our dishes or turn the lights on in our room. Every day we make a dozen decisions or more that we could start to make in a more sustainable way. And if we all made just those better decisions that much more each day, and we all did it while we cared about things beyond just ourselves, yeah, I think we absolutely can make a difference. I'm an optimist. Other questions, comments, concerns?
Okay. And I want to make sure that we capture all the questions. Any questions for David Wooten?
So this is kind of like, it's still kind of on topic, but so I'm interested in like conservation. And so sorry about the background noise. I'm at my mom's house.
You're fine.
But so I'm interested in also being like a veterinarian, but I'm also interested in conservation. Could I like say work at a zoo and like do conservation while also being a veterinarian? Like, I know that's like not completely what you were talking about, but
Yeah, no, finding those jobs that give you some financial security, right? Working with animals at the level you're talking, they're out there, right? You can be a vet, you can be a zoo vet, you can be a conservation wildlife officer, and somewhere in there, there's hybridization of those careers. Undoubtedly, can I be a vet while at the same time I'm tromping around the Amazon trying to do animal conservation? That might be a harder thing to hybridize. But I think you're in the right ballpark here, Lexi, that looking at zoos, looking at conservation officers, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, DNR, there's a lot of combination there of both conservation and veterinary care that I think you could find a hybrid between those two. And then there's always the other option, which is you don't necessarily have to make everything you love a career path. And so what you could wind up saying, you might say to yourself, hey, I find that the veterinary route is what I'm most passionate about, and that's what I want to do with animals. So I'm going to be a vet. And that's going to give you job security and medical coverage and maybe even some weekends off. Congratulations. Yes. And then now you got some time and money that you can devote to what? Animal conservation, right? To be volunteer, go run programs, be a part of things. There's a lot of hybridization between those things that you can do. I'm not going to lie, it's difficult to turn a passion for animals into a sustainable job career, but it's doable. And there's always an opportunity to volunteer on the side if you're on your way or not quite there yet. Anyone going into wildlife biology, why are you not volunteering right now? Why are you not volunteering at Leslie Science and Nature Center, Howell Nature Center? Why aren't you somehow getting involved? You want to do that beyond your degrees for sure, because that experience is going to really put you ahead of the curve.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. No, the leading cause of couple of things here. So the lower numbers in Massasaugas is one part of the natural biology. This is not a populated species like garter snakes that are found everywhere. Massasaugas has specific habitat. The habitat's limited, and so therefore so is their population size. So you're not going to run across them even on their best day like you would a water snake or a garter snake. Secondly, the number one reason for concern in Massasauga loss is habitat loss, right? Losing our wetlands is the number one reason why we lose our Massasaugas. But snake fungal disease is on the rise. Dr. Jennifer Moore, I think she's out of, oh, don't quote me, it's either Saginaw Valley or Grand Valley. Don't quote me on that. But Dr. Jennifer Moore, we did Massasauga work together when we were both in grad school. And she's doing incredible work right now with Massasaugas and snake fungal disease here in Michigan. Go check out Dr. Jennifer Moore's work.
Excellent questions. Any other questions? Well, we have them here. All right. Well, I think